Greetings, Sean here again, and welcome to night 12 of Spooktober. I will be doing another reading for you today. It's going to be just a collection of short, scary stories, so I hope you enjoy the video, and without any further ado, there we go. Let's get into it. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office, talking about one thing or another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark it was hard to tell for sure. Then it was just simply gone. But soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back into the field. Then it came out a third time and started toward them. By now Ted and Sam were scared, and they started running, but when they finally stopped, they decided they were being foolish. They weren't sure that what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it, for it was coming to greet them. He was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try and touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into its face. It had black, bright, penetrating eyes sunk deep in its head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran. But this time, the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out in the road for a while, pacing back and forth, watching them through the window. Then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. And the night that Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the Thing. Story 2. Cold as Clay. A father had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on this earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Jim, but the farmer did not think Jim was good, or at all, or nearly good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the country. Soon after she left, Jim got sick and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life that they may have had together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. "Your father asked me to come get you," he said. "I came on his best horse." "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. "Oh, why, you're as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you are not ill." And she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they'd reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he exclaimed. She turned to Jim, but he was gone, and so was the horse. They went back to the stable to look for them, but the horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death, then quickly went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave. The corpse was in its coffin, but around its head they found a handkerchief. Story 3. The White Wolf. The timber wolves around French Creek had gotten out of hand. There were so many wolves the farmers could not stop them from killing their cattle and sheep. So, the state put a bounty on them. It would pay a hunter $10 for every wolf pelt that hunter turned in. A butcher in town named Bill Williams thought that was pretty good money. He stopped working as a butcher and started killing wolves, and he was very good at it. Every year, he killed over 500 of them. That came to more than $5,000. It was quite a bit of money in those days. After 4 or 5 years, Bill had killed so many wolves that there were hardly any left in the area. So he retired, and he vowed to never harm another wolf, because it was wolves that had made him rich. Then one day, a farmer reported that a white wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He had shot at it and hit it, but the bullets didn't seem to have any effect. Soon that wolf was seen all over the countryside, killing, running, but nobody could stop it. One night, it came into Bill's yard, and it killed his pet cow. Bill forgot about his decision to never harm another wolf. He went into town the next morning and bought a young lamb for bait. He took it out into the hills and tied it to a tree. And he backed off about 50 yards and sat down under another tree with his gun in his lap. And he waited. When Bill didn't come back, his friends started looking for him. Finally, they found the lamb. It was still tied to a tree, and while hungry, it was still very much alive. Then they found Bill. He was sitting against another tree, dead, his throat torn open. But there was no sign of a struggle. His gun hadn't been fired, and there were no tracks in the soils around him. As for the white wolf, it was never seen again. Story number 4. The Haunted House. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Story number 4. The Haunted House. Story number 4. The Haunted House. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So his preacher took his Bible, and he went into the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. He sat there, reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something stir up in the cellar, walking back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream, but it got suddenly cut off. Then there was a lot of thrashing and struggling, and finally everything suddenly went silent. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up from the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. The door shut all on its own, but there was no sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read for a while. When he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire, then the haunter started walking again, step cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman, and he backed away in fright and asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" The hunter sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do, until she just simply faded away. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and he waited. It wasn't long before the haunt started up again slowly. Step, step, closer and closer. Step, step. It was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him, bearing his cross. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room straight at him, as quickly as lightning, and took a hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and flesh was dropping off of her face, so that he could see the bones and parts of her teeth beneath it. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light all the way back at the back of her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for money and buried her in the cellar. She said that if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could finally rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and lay it in the collection plate at church next morning, and he will find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, so you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down to the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house at midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearthrug. He did, and he found a large sack of money. Where that haunt had held onto his coat, the print of bony fingers was burned right in the cloth, and it never came out. Story number 5. The Guests. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper, but they had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. So they decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said, so they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they'd be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee and brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. When the young couple had taken to their room, they again explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their host awakened. On the table near the front door, they left an envelope with money in it for the room, and they went on to the next town. They stopped in a restaurant and had breakfast, and when they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "This can't be," he said. "That has burned to the ground, and the men and women who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house, only there was no house. What they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened, when suddenly the woman screamed. In the rubble was a badly burned table, and on the table was the envelope of money they had left that morning. We stood on a grave. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just a superstition." "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl, "and I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves, and then we will know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows. It was quiet as death. "There's nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself. But she was scared anyway. She picked up a grave and stood on it, then quickly bent over and plunged the knife into the soil. She started to leave, but she couldn't. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time, but couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me," she screamed, as she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her own skirt and pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had simply died of fright. Story number 7. A new horse. 2 farmhands shared a room. One slept at the back of the room, and the other slept near the door. After a while, the one who slept near the door began to feel very tired. After a while, the one who slept near the door began to feel very tired early in the day. His friend asked what was wrong. "An awful thing happens every night," he said. "A witch turns me into a horse, and she rides me all over the countryside." "I'll sleep in your bed tonight," his friend said. "We'll see if it happens to me." About midnight, an old woman who lives nearby came into the room. She mumbled some strange words over the farmhand, and he found he couldn't move. Then she slipped a bridle on him, and she turned him into a horse. The next thing he knew, she was riding him across the fields at breakneck speed, beating him to make him go even faster. Soon they came to a house where a party was happening. There was a lot of music and dancing, and they were having a great old time inside. She hitched him to a fence and went in. While she was gone, the farmhand would rub against the fence until the bridle came off, and he turned back into a human being. Then he went into the house and found the witch. He spoke those strange words over her, and put the bridle on her and turned her into a horse. Then he rode her to a blacksmith and had her fitted with horseshoes. After that, he rode her to the farm where she lived. "I have a pretty good filly here," he told her husband, "but I need a stronger horse. Would you like to trade?" The old man looked her over and said he would do it, and they picked out another horse, and the farmhand rode away. Her husband led his new horse to the barn. He took off the bridle and went to hang it up. But when he came back, the new horse was gone. Instead, there stood his wife with horseshoes nailed to her hands and feet. Oh! Ouch. Story number 8. Alligators. A young woman in town married a man from another part of the country. He was a nice fellow, and they got along pretty well, but there was only one problem. Every night he'd go swimming in the river. Sometimes he would be gone all night long, and she would complain of how lonely she was. His couple had 2 young sons. As soon as the boys could walk, their father began to teach them how to swim. And when they got to be old enough, he took them swimming in the river at night. Often they would stay there all night long, and the young woman would stay home all by herself. After a while, she began to act in a strange way. At least, that's what the neighbors said. She told them that her husband would turn into an alligator, and then he would turn the boys into alligators. Everyone told her there was nothing wrong with a man making his son swim. It was a natural thing to do, and when it came to alligators, there just weren't any nearby. Everybody knew that. Early one morning, the young woman came running into town from the direction of the river. She was soaking wet. She had a big alligator and 2 little alligators had pulled her in and tried to get her to eat her raw fish. They were her husband and her sons, they said, and they wanted her to live with them, but she had gotten away. Her doctor decided that she had quite simply gone insane and lost her mind, and he had her put into a hospital for a while. After that, nobody saw her husband or boys again. They just simply disappeared. But now and then, a fisherman would tell about seeing alligators in a river at night, especially as it being 1 large alligator and 2 small ones. But people said they were just making it up. Everyone knows there are not alligators around here. Story number 9. Room for one more. A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. They stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned, and he simply could not sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. Whispering makes me yawn. Like I'm not sleepy and I wasn't yawned before I started this. Whispering makes me yawn. Like I would be fully rested to do Call of Cthulhu and it'd make me yawn. Maybe it's the lack of oxygen.
You're still breathing.
Yeah, but I'm not pulling in as much. Because it doesn't take as much to whisper. Okay. Sometime to the night, he heard a car turn into a driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked at him. When Blackwell saw his odd, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him, "There's room for one more." Then he waited for a minute or 2, and he drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends. What had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "Oh, there's no way I could have been," he said. "But it didn't seem like a dream. Maybe I was." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back to the street, but when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There's room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming and the sound of a sudden crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone on board was killed. So that is the number 3. southwest into the desert from Del Rio, Texas, and eventually you'll come to the Devil's River. In the 1830s, a trapper named John Dent and his wife Molly settled where Dry Creek runs into Devil's River. Dent was after a beaver, which there were plentiful there. He and Molly built a cabin from brush, and near it they put up an arbor to give them some shade. Molly Dent became pregnant. When she was ready to have the child, John Dent raced back on a horse to the nearest neighbors several miles away. "My wife is having a baby," he said to the man and his wife. "Can you please help us?" They agreed to come at once. As they got ready to leave, a violent storm suddenly came up, and a bolt of lightning struck and killed John Dent on the spot. The man and his wife managed to find his cabin, but they did not arrive until the next day. By then, Molly Dent, too, was dead. It looked as if she had given birth before she died, but the neighbors could not find the baby. Since there were wolf tracks all around, they decided that the wolves had simply made a meal of it. They buried Molly Dent and left. A number of years after she died, people began to tell a strange tale. Some swore it was true, others said it was no way it could have happened. The story begins at a small settlement a dozen miles from Molly Dent's grave. Early one morning, a pack of wolves raced in from the desert and killed some goats. Such attacks were not unusual these days, but a boy thought he saw a naked girl with long blonde hair running with the wolves. A year or two later, a woman came upon some wolves eating a goat they had just killed. Eating the goat with them, she claimed, was a naked young girl with a long blonde hair. When the wolves and the girl saw her, they fled. The woman said at first the girl ran on all fours. Then she stood and ran like a human, as swiftly as the wolves. People started to wonder if this wolf girl was Molly Dent's daughter. Had a mother wolf carried her off that day she was born and raised her as her pups? If so, by now she would be around 10 to 11 years old. As the story is told, some men began to look for the girl. As the story is told, some men began to look for the girl. They searched along the river banks and in the desert and in its canyons. Then one day, it is said, they found her walking in a canyon with a wolf at her side. When the wolf ran off, the girl hid in an opening in one of the canyon walls. But when the men tried to fight her or capture her, she fought back, biting and scratching as if she was an enraged animal. When they finally subdued her, she began screaming like a frightened young girl and howling like a frightened young wolf. Her captors bound her with rope, put her across a horse, and it took her to a small ranch house in the desert. They would turn her over to the sheriff the next day, they decided. They placed her in an empty room and untied her. Terror-stricken, she hid in the shadows. They left her and locked the door. Soon she was screaming and howling again. The men thought they would go mad listening to her, but at last she stopped. When night fell, wolves began howling. In the distance, people say that each time they stopped, the girl howled in reply. As the story goes, the cry of wolves come from every direction and got closer and closer. Suddenly, as if a signal had been given, wolves attacked the horses and other livestock. The men rushed into the distance. Darkness, firing their guns. Years passed with no word of the girl. Then one day, some men on horseback came around a bend in the Rio Grande, not far from the Devil's River. They claimed she saw a young woman with long, long blonde hair feeding 2 wolf pups. When she saw the men, she snatched up the pups and ran into the brush. They rode after her, but she quickly left them behind. They searched and searched, but no trace of her. It is the last we know of the wolf girl, and it is there, in the desert, near the Rio Grande, that the story ends. So, that was 10 scary stories. I hope you all have enjoyed Spooktober so far, and I particularly hope you enjoyed tonight and my previous night, the Call of Cthulhu. I know I read really, really fast, so I tried to be a little bit better this time around. So, thanks for watching, guys. Bye.